No one in Graybridge noticed when the man stopped sleeping. That was the first mistake. Graybridge was the kind of city that stayed awake without really being alive. Convenience stores open at all hours, trains rattling through the night, apartment windows glowing like tired eyes. Insomnia didn't stand out there. It blended in. The man's name was Evan Cole. He was 38 years old, recently divorced, recently promoted, and outwardly unremarkable. He lived alone on the 7th floor of a concrete apartment block overlooking a rail yard that never rested. His neighbors knew him only as the quiet man who left early and came home late, the man who nodded politely but never lingered, the man who always looked slightly distracted, like he was listening to something no one else could hear. At first, Evan told himself it was temporary, a stressful quarter at work, the divorce paperwork, the unfamiliar silence of an empty apartment. He lay in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of electricity in the walls, the distant clatter of freight cars coupling and uncoupling below. His thoughts ran in small, manageable loops. Tomorrow I'll sleep. I just need one good night. When sleep didn't come, he didn't panic. He got up, made tea, scrolled his phone, watched the clock tick forward with mechanical indifference. By the 4th night, his thoughts had sharpened. By the 7th, they had begun to turn against him. Evan started arriving at work earlier than anyone else, not out of ambition. There was simply nowhere else to go. His co-workers joked about his dedication, his grind. They didn't notice the tremor in his hands, the faint redness around his eyes, the way he flinched at sudden sounds. Sleep deprivation doesn't announce itself loudly. It erodes. Evan's memory slipped first. Names he'd known for years vanished mid-conversation. He lost track of time, stared at emails he couldn't remember writing. His inner monologue grew louder, harsher, less forgiving. You're failing. They can see it. You can't stop now. By the 10th day, Evan stopped feeling tired. That frightened him more than exhaustion ever had. His body moved as if fueled by something artificial, something brittle. His thoughts accelerated, overlapping, colliding. He felt wired, alert, hyper-aware. Sounds sharpened unnaturally. The click of keyboards, the scrape of chairs, the buzz of fluorescent lights drilling into his skull. At night, he no longer tried to sleep. He paced. He cleaned obsessively, rearranged furniture at 3 a.m., stood at his window watching the trains, convinced he could detect patterns in their movement, messages, rhythms, intentions. He began keeping the television on constantly, not to watch it, but to drown out the silence, because silence had become dangerous. In silence, he heard things, not voices at first, more like impressions, the sense of being watched, of being evaluated. His reflection in the bathroom mirror looked subtly wrong to him, as if delayed by half a second. His own eyes felt unfamiliar, too bright, too intent. By the 2nd week, Evan started missing meals. Hunger felt irrelevant. Food tasted like cardboard anyway. Coffee became his only constant companion, cup after cup, until his hands shook violently. At work, his supervisor pulled him aside. "You look exhausted," she said gently. "You should take a day." Evan smiled too quickly. "I'm fine. Never been sharper." He believed it. That was the problem. Sleep deprivation had crossed into something else, something clinicians would later label acute insomnia-induced psychosis. At the time, Evan only knew that his thoughts felt important, urgent, that everything suddenly made sense if you looked at it the right way. He started writing things down, not notes, not reminders, theories. He filled notebooks with fragmented sentences, arrows, diagrams connecting unrelated events. He became convinced his insomnia wasn't accidental, that it had been triggered, that someone or something was keeping him awake on purpose. The building, the trains, the lights. He complained to the property manager about electrical interference, about vibrations in the walls. The manager smiled politely and suggested earplugs. Evan threw them away. Earplugs, he decided, were a way to stop people from hearing what they needed to hear. By day 16, Evan no longer trusted mirrors. By day 18, he stopped answering his phone. By day 20, the hallucinations arrived. They came quietly at first, movement in the corner of his vision, shadows slipping away when he turned his head, then faces in the crowd that lingered too long, eyes locking onto his with uncomfortable precision. He became certain people were communicating without words, exchanging information he was never meant to access. At night, he stood in his apartment holding a kitchen knife, not to hurt anyone, he told himself that repeatedly, but to feel grounded, real, awake in a way that mattered. The knife felt cold and reassuring in his hand. Sleep deprivation strips away empathy before it takes reason. Evan began to see people not as individuals, but as obstacles, noise, threats, variables in a system that was collapsing around him. The final warning came from his own body. Heart palpitations, sudden nausea, a splitting headache that made light feel like glass. He collapsed briefly in the stairwell one morning, waking minutes later drenched in sweat, unsure how long he'd been unconscious. Instead of seeking help, Evan interpreted it as confirmation. They're pushing you too far, his mind insisted. They want you to break. The idea took root and grew fast. By the time Evan reached 24 days without sleep, he was no longer the man who had simply failed to rest. He was a man living inside a waking nightmare, convinced he was the only one who could see the danger coming. And in Graybridge, a city that never slept, no one noticed the moment a helpless insomniac crossed the line into something far more dangerous. The violent breakdown was already forming. It was only a matter of time before someone else paid the price for a man who never slept. By the fourth week without sleep, Evan Cole no longer experienced time as a straight line. Hours folded in on themselves, minutes stretched and snapped. Morning light felt artificial, like a stage prop rolled in too early. Night never truly arrived. Darkness simply hovered, thin and unreliable, like a suggestion. Evan had stopped going to work. At first, he sent emails filled with long explanations that barely made sense, insisting he was working remotely and monitoring emerging patterns. When his supervisor replied with concern and a request for a doctor's note, Evan deleted the message without opening it fully. He had begun to believe written communication could be used to track him. Phones were worse. He wrapped his phone in a towel and shoved it into the back of a drawer, convinced the vibrations he felt in his pocket were not imaginary, just too subtle for other people to notice. When the drawer continued to hum in his perception, he unplugged every electronic device in the apartment, plunging the space into an unnatural quiet that immediately filled with imagined noise. The mind, deprived of sleep, does not rest. It hunts. Evan began seeing meaning everywhere. License plates carried coded messages. The rhythm of passing trains aligned too perfectly with his thoughts. Snippets of conversation overheard in the stairwell felt directed at him, even when no one was there. One afternoon, he stood at the bathroom sink and watched the water spiral down the drain. He became convinced it was slowing. "They're adjusting the flow," his mind whispered, "testing your awareness." He laughed then, a sharp, brittle sound that startled him. It echoed strangely, as if the walls absorbed it too eagerly. Hallucinations evolved from fleeting shadows into fully formed perceptions. Faces appeared briefly in reflective surfaces, not strangers, but distorted versions of people he once knew. His ex-wife, a former coworker, his father, long dead, staring with quiet disappointment. When Evan blinked, they vanished, leaving only his own reflection, gaunt and unfamiliar. His inner voice no longer felt like his own. It spoke in commands. Stay awake. "You're close now. They can't act if you don't sleep." Physically, his body was failing. His hands shook constantly, his vision doubled, then corrected itself with painful effort. He developed micro-sleeps, involuntary lapses lasting seconds, but they terrified him more than exhaustion ever had. Each time he snapped awake, heart racing, he was certain something had almost happened, something catastrophic. He taped his eyelids open one night. The tape didn't hold. He screamed in frustration, tearing it away, clawing at his face until his skin burned. He punched the bathroom wall hard enough to fracture drywall, then stared at the hole for an hour, convinced it was watching him back. Neighbors began to notice. Footsteps pacing at all hours, furniture scraping in the night, a man shouting at no one through thin apartment walls. A resident across the hall called building management, describing erratic behavior and possible drug use. Management left a notice on Evan's door. He read it 10 times, interpreting different meanings each time. By the final reading, he was certain it was a warning disguised as bureaucracy. "They're escalating," he thought. That night, Evan barricaded his door with a bookcase. He placed kitchen knives on the counter in neat rows, not as weapons, he told himself, but as anchors, objects he could see and touch, proof that reality still existed in solid forms. His notebooks filled faster now. Theories gave way to accusations. Names appeared, neighbors, co-workers, public figures, linked by arrows and circles, all converging toward a central point labeled simply, awake. Evan believed sleep was surrender. Sleep was how they got in. The city outside felt hostile, too bright, too loud, too synchronized. On the rare occasions he ventured out, he wore sunglasses even at night, convinced streetlights were tracking his movements. He avoided eye contact, interpreting casual glances as surveillance. Once, at a grocery store, a child laughed nearby. The sound pierced Evan like an alarm. He dropped his basket and fled, convinced the laugh was a signal. Reality had become layered, the visible world overlaid with imagined intent. Every action carried hidden meaning. Every pause felt like preparation for something worse. The breakdown accelerated quietly. Evan stopped recognizing hunger, thirst, even pain. His sense of self fractured into fragments: observer, target, defender. He no longer felt like a man losing sleep, he felt like a system under attack. The final descent began the night he heard footsteps inside his apartment. Not imagined footsteps, or so he believed. He froze, breath shallow, heart slamming against his ribs. The sound came again, slow, deliberate. He gripped one of the knives, body vibrating with adrenaline. "Who's there?" he whispered. No answer. The footsteps stopped. Minutes passed, or hours. Time was meaningless now. Evan searched the apartment room by room, finding nothing out of place, but the certainty remained. Someone had been there. Someone had tested his defenses. That was when fear transformed into resolve. "You can't just wait anymore," the voice insisted. "Waiting is how people disappear." Evan sat on the floor as dawn bled weakly through the blinds, surrounded by notebooks, barricades, and weapons that felt increasingly necessary. His thoughts were no longer racing. They were narrowing, fixating. There was a problem, and problems, he believed, required action. By the time the sun rose fully over Graybridge, Evan Cole was no longer teetering on the edge of violence. He was preparing for it. By the 36th day without real sleep, Evan Cole no longer trusted the boundary between thought and action. The city of Graybridge woke as it always did. Commuters moving like clockwork, shop lights flickering on, winter air sharp and clean. But to Evan, the morning felt staged, too orderly, too calm. Calm, he believed, meant concealment. He stood at his window for hours, watching the street below. People passed the building again and again. The same faces, the same pace. a woman walking her dog twice within minutes, a man checking his watch at the exact moment Evan glanced down. Patterns stacked on patterns until coincidence no longer existed in his mind. "They're rehearsing," the voice said quietly. "This is the day." Evan had not slept at all the night before, not even the terrifying seconds-long lapses his body sometimes forced upon him. Instead, he sat upright in a chair, eyes burning, muscles rigid, knife resting on his knee like a talisman. His heart hammered steadily, no longer racing, but heavy and deliberate. This was different. This was clarity, or what felt like clarity. At 9:17 a.m., there was a knock at the door. The sound detonated inside his skull. 3 knocks, firm, professional. Evan did not move. The knocking came again. "Building management," a man's voice called through the door. "We need to talk to you." Evan's breath caught. Management was never early. Management never insisted. Management never brought backup, because Evan was certain there were 2 sets of footsteps now, one heavier than the other. "This is it," he thought. "They're here to take you while you're still awake." He backed away from the door, knocking over a stack of notebooks. Pages spilled across the floor, diagrams, accusations, sleepless logic scribbled in frantic handwriting. He stepped over them, retreating into the bedroom, eyes darting to every shadow. "Sir," the voice called again, louder now. "We've had complaints. We just need to make sure you're okay." Okay. The word felt mocking. Evan pressed his hands against his ears, but the voice leaked through anyway, echoing and distorting, breaking into fragments. Make sure. Complaints. Okay. The voice in his head grew firmer. If you answer, you lose control. If you open the door, you disappear. Something inside Evan hardened. He grabbed his coat, shoved his feet into boots without socks, and slipped out the bedroom window onto the fire escape. Cold air slapped his face, grounding him just enough to move. He climbed down shakily, metal rungs vibrating beneath his weight, every sound amplified into a threat. When his boots hit the alley pavement, he ran, not with a plan, with purpose. The streets felt narrower now, closing in as he moved. Traffic noises roared too loud. Sirens in the distance felt personal. Every glance from a stranger felt loaded with intent. Evan believed he was being flushed out. He ducked into a convenience store to warm up, pacing the aisles, hands trembling. Fluorescent lights hummed violently overhead, drilling into his skull. He fixated on the clerk behind the counter, a man in his 20s, bored, scrolling on his phone. The clerk looked up. Their eyes met. Evan froze. The look lasted maybe a second, neutral, meaningless, but Evan's mind exploded with interpretation. He was certain the clerk's expression shifted, that something passed between them, silent but confirming. "He knows," the voice said. "They all know." Evan dropped a bottle of water. It shattered, sending liquid across the floor. The sound snapped the moment open. The clerk cursed softly and stepped out from behind the counter. "Hey, you all right, man?" The question felt like a test. Evan backed away, heart pounding so hard he thought he might pass out. His thoughts collapsed into a single blinding certainty. He was trapped. What happened next unfolded fast, not as a blur, but as a series of painfully sharp moments. A raised voice, a sudden movement, the world tipping sideways as panic overwhelmed reason. People shouted, someone screamed. When Evan stumbled back into the street minutes later, his hands were shaking violently, his breathing ragged, his mind screaming that something irreversible had just occurred. He did not fully understand what he had done, only that the line he had been clinging to was gone. Reality did not reset. It escalated. Police sirens wailed closer now, unmistakable. Evan ran again, legs burning, vision tunneling, thoughts disintegrating into fragments of guilt, fear, and justification. You had no choice. They forced it. This is survival. He hid in an abandoned construction site near the river, crouching behind concrete barriers as blue and red lights flashed across the skyline. For the first time in weeks, exhaustion crushed him completely. His body finally betrayed him. Evan collapsed and slept. Not peacefully, but violently, convulsively, his mind plunging into fractured dreams filled with shouting voices and distorted faces. When he woke hours later, surrounded by officers, the world felt muted, distant, unreal. The awakening was worse than the sleeplessness, because this time the consequences were real and permanent. Evan Cole woke up restrained. At first, he thought he was still dreaming. The sensation of weight on his wrists and ankles felt distant, like pressure through thick fabric. His eyes opened slowly, lids heavy, visions swimming. White ceiling tiles hovered above him, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly, their rhythm too steady to be imagined. He tried to move. Metal clinked. Panic surged instantly, sharp and instinctive, but it lacked the manic energy that had fueled him days earlier. This panic was dulled, slowed by something chemical and heavy settling through his veins. "Easy," a calm voice said nearby. "You're safe." Safe. The word echoed strangely. Evan turned his head and saw a nurse standing a few feet away, clipboard in hand, her posture relaxed but alert. Behind her, a uniformed officer leaned against the wall, arms folded, eyes fixed on Evan with professional distance. Memory arrived in pieces. The convenience store, the shouting, running, sirens slicing through the air, cold concrete under his cheek. His stomach dropped. What happened?" Evan asked, his voice hoarse, barely recognizable as his own. The nurse exchanged a brief look with the officer. "You had a medical emergency," she said carefully. "You're in county hospital. You've been sedated for your own safety." "For my safety?" Evan repeated. The officer stepped forward slightly. "Evan Cole, you're being held pending evaluation. There was an incident earlier today." Incident. The word landed like a verdict. Evan's mind tried to resist, tried to slide away from the implications, but clarity, fragile and painful, was creeping back in. His thoughts were no longer racing. The voices were quiet. The certainty that had driven him was gone, replaced by a yawning emptiness and a rising sense of dread. "I didn't mean to," Evan whispered, though he wasn't sure what he meant anymore. Over the next several hours, time blurred. Doctors came and went. Questions repeated themselves. Had he slept? Was he hearing voices? Did he feel watched? Did he know where he was? Evan answered honestly now, painfully honestly. "No." "Yes. I thought they were coming for me. I don't know why." A psychiatrist named Dr. Lena Morell sat with him the longest. She spoke slowly, deliberately, as if pacing her words to match his fragile state. "You've been experiencing acute insomnia-induced psychosis," she explained. "Severe sleep deprivation can fundamentally alter perception, judgment, and impulse control. Your brain hasn't had the chance to reset." Evan stared at her, hollow-eyed. "So, I'm not crazy?" Dr. Morell didn't answer immediately. "You were sick," she said instead, "very sick, and no one caught it in time." The weight of that settled heavily, because someone had noticed. The landlord, the co-workers, the neighbors who complained about pacing footsteps at night, Evan himself. He had known something was wrong. He had asked for help in clumsy, half-hearted ways. He had joked about not sleeping. He had minimized it. Everyone had. Sleep deprivation wasn't taken seriously until it was too late. Later that evening, the restraints were removed. Evan was transferred to a secure psychiatric unit under police supervision. He was allowed a shower, clean clothes, and at last rest, induced and monitored. The first real sleep he experienced lasted nearly 14 hours. When he woke, the clarity was devastating. The memories returned, sharper now, stripped of delusion. He remembered the fear in the clerk's voice, the sound of glass breaking, the moment when panic tipped into irreversible action. Evan covered his face with his hands and cried silently, shoulders shaking. There was no voice to justify it anymore, only guilt. Days passed in a controlled rhythm: meals, evaluations, therapy sessions, paperwork. Evan learned that the incident had left someone seriously injured, alive but changed. The relief he felt was immediately followed by shame for feeling relieved at all. Dr. Morell spoke to him again, this time more directly. "You're going to face legal consequences," she said directly, "but your mental state at the time will be considered. This doesn't erase what happened, but it explains it." Explain, not excuse. Evan nodded, numb. At night, sleep came more easily now, but it brought nightmares, distorted replays of paranoia and fear, his mind trying to reconcile what it had done with who he believed himself to be. In one session, Dr. Morell asked quietly, "Do you remember when you first stopped sleeping?" Evan thought for a long moment. "I remember when I stopped trying," he said finally. That answer stayed with her, because insomnia, untreated and dismissed, rarely announces itself as dangerous. It arrives quietly, gradually, convincingly. It convinces its victims that they are still in control long after control is gone. By the end of the week, Evan was charged. The news labeled him many things: unstable, dangerous, a mystery. Few headlines mentioned sleep. Fewer still questioned how a man could unravel so completely without intervention. Evan watched the coverage from a small television in the ward, feeling like he was watching someone else's life, someone he no longer recognized, and yet someone he would always be responsible for. The trial did not begin with spectacle. There were no dramatic outbursts, no shouted accusations, no sudden confessions. Instead, it opened quietly, almost uncomfortably so, with a courtroom filled by people who looked like they could have been anywhere else on any ordinary day. That ordinariness was what unsettled the town of Graybridge most. Evan Cole entered the courtroom thinner, calmer, and visibly older than the man shown in the surveillance stills that had circulated online months earlier. His hair was cut short, his posture was stiff, his eyes rarely left the floor. He slept now. That fact alone felt cruel. The prosecution laid out the sequence of events with methodical restraint: the weeks of erratic behavior, the complaints, the incident that had changed one life forever. They did not sensationalize. They didn't need to. The facts were heavy enough. Then came the medical testimony. Dr. Lena Morell took the stand and spoke not of evil, but of biology. She explained what prolonged insomnia does to the brain, how the prefrontal cortex loses its grip, how threat perception overwhelms logic, how hallucinations and delusions don't feel like imagination, but truth. She described how sleep deprivation can erode empathy, distort intention, and collapse impulse control. This was not a man making rational choices, she said evenly. This was a man whose brain was failing. The courtroom was silent. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably, others leaned forward. The defense did not argue innocence, they argued understanding. Evan took the stand briefly. His voice shook at first, then steadied as he spoke, not to justify himself, but to describe the descent. He said, "I thought staying awake meant I was strong. I thought if I didn't sleep, I couldn't be caught off guard. I didn't know my mind was breaking. I didn't know until it was already gone." He looked toward the victim, who sat quietly with family members beside them. "I'm sorry," he said. "I will carry this for the rest of my life." There were no tears in the courtroom, just a thick, suffocating quiet. The verdict came after 3 days of deliberation, guilty with diminished responsibility. Evan was sentenced to a long-term psychiatric facility under correctional supervision with the possibility of monitored release many years later, depending on treatment progress and risk evaluation. The town reacted in fragments. Some were angry, some were relieved, some were confused. Many argued online about accountability versus compassion, comment sections filled with arguments that went nowhere. But beneath the noise, something else happened, something quieter. People began talking about sleep. Doctors in Graybridge reported a spike in appointments. Employers quietly updated wellness policies. Parents asked their teenagers if they were getting enough rest and listened to the answers. The convenience store reopened months later with new staff and new lighting. Customers lingered longer than they used to. They spoke more gently. They noticed each other. Evan never returned to that street. Inside the facility, his days became structured, repetitive, and slow. Therapy sessions, monitored sleep, medication adjustments. The voices never fully returned, but neither did the man he used to be. In group therapy, Evan rarely spoke. When he did, it was always about the same thing. He would say, "I didn't think lack of sleep could do that." No one in the room disagreed. Years later, Dr. Morell would reference the case in medical conferences, anonymized, stripped of names, presented as a warning, not of madness, not of violence, but of neglect. Because insomnia is often treated like a joke, a badge of productivity, a temporary inconvenience, but in rare, devastating cases, it becomes something else entirely, a slow, invisible erosion of reality itself. Evan Cole's story never became a documentary. It never inspired a podcast series. It faded into archives and court records and quiet professional discussions. But its lesson remained. Sleep is not rest. Sleep is regulation. Sleep is protection. Sleep is the thin line between control and chaos. And when that line breaks, sometimes the damage is done long before anyone realizes they're awake inside a nightmare.